traditioned theism, secular liberalism, and Nietzschean individualism. All this and more in this conversation I have with my friend, the Reverend Scott Williams, who's a priest here in my diocese. I think Scott is a really thoughtful guy, and I think this episode is super helpful because it helps paint the picture of the world we live in a way that's way more accurate and nuanced than a simple, like, liberal conservative divide that a lot of Christian YouTube channels get a whole lot of mileage out of. And so I do hope you watch this. I hope it's thought provoking. Get on Google, chase down those names that are unfamiliar to you, and let's up the level of conversation here on YouTube around Christianity, theology, and what culture and these various things that shape us are. Hello and welcome to All Things Necessary, a podcast about Christianity, particularly as expressed through the Anglican tradition and the Episcopal Church. I am David Johnston, and I'm here with a friend of mine, Scott Williams, who is a priest in the Episcopal Church here in my same diocese of West Virginia, as well as the assistant professor of philosophy at West Virginia Wesleyan College. So welcome, Father Scott.
Thanks a lot. I'm excited to be here.
So Scott and I both went to the same seminary, but not at the same time, Duke Divinity School, which means he and I kind of share a lot of overlapping theological commitments that are all 100% correct as they turn out, which is helpful, right?
Yeah. Lucky for us.
Lucky for us.
Yeah.
And he and I DM back and forth about lots of stuff about that's going on, and I always find Scott really engaging, and I hope you will too. As we were chatting a little bit before we hit record, Scott shared with me that he just wrapped up teaching a course entitled God, Religion, and the Secular, which sounds really interesting, touches on Charles Taylor, Friedrich Nietzsche, and more, and things about liberalism and how that shapes the world today, and how Christian tradition responds or doesn't to that. And I'm hoping we can get back into a bit of the conversation he and I were having about that. So yeah, just tell me about this course, God, Religion, and the Secular.
Well, one of the things that really concerned me, or came to concern me with some of my students, whether they arrived to see me from having been homeschooled in deeply evangelical homes, or they were completely secular, and secular in the sense of somebody who thinks of their life as meaningful without ever needing to raise the question of God or the transcendent, is that these groups of people, and of course everything's more complicated than that, but that these groups of people were incomprehensible to one another. And this leads to a lot of lack of generosity, of unreceptiveness, of straw manning, people who don't share your outlook or worldview. And the other problem is that I find that the resources that they had to draw on were basically funded by the culture wars, by the divide between conservatives and liberals. And that's just a blind alley from my perspective in terms of trying to come to mutual forms of understanding, to what an old teacher of mine, Ron Coles, used to call receptive generosity, when we deal with people who don't share our outlook or worldview. And so in that course, I rely a great deal on the thought of Charles Taylor and another guy, James K.A. Smith, who wrote a book about a Charles Taylor book. Smith's book is called How Not to Be Secular. Charles Taylor wrote this tome back in 2007 called A Secular Age, and I read it at the time and found it so compelling. And I was like, boy, if only I could feed this to my students, but it's impossible. It's written for other philosophers. It would be unjust to try to subject them to it. Well, apparently James K.A. Smith had the same thought, only he's not as lazy as I am. So he went ahead and wrote a book to try to render Taylor's argument in terms that were consumable for undergrads and lay people and non-philosophers. And so I relied a lot upon that in structuring the course. And one of its goals was to try to get my students to think more deeply about the really fundamental, basic assumptions, presumptions that they are bringing to how they see and interpret the world, and how they see and interpret those who do not share their imaginary, their way of imagining the world and human life, and what makes it meaningful or worthwhile, if anything does.
Yeah.
And Taylor's view, and it's not original to him really. We could draw on McIntyre or John Milbank or Catherine Pickstock. I mean, there are a lot of resources you could draw on here that, and things are more complicated than this even, but that there are at least three sort of really vital sets of influences that are operative in our society. And the conservative liberal divide just fails completely to capture the complexity of the things that are influencing how people in our society see the world,
Okay.
and answer questions about human meaning.
So what are those three things?
Taylor tells a story that unfolds in stages, and we don't necessarily need to rely on him in our conversation totally. What you have is a set of historical observations is in medieval Europe, a kind of medieval consensus about the sources that we draw on when we're making moral and political judgments. And by the way, I don't want to be misunderstood here. This is not nostalgia for Christendom or, like, oh, in the good old days, we had all this Christian consensus. I mean, like the Middle Ages were horrifying in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But you do have, there are a couple features of it where traditional theism, an Abrahamic picture of reality, first of all, says that all of existence is teleological, that it's purposeful, that it is made to serve God, and that human existence specifically finds its goal, its telos, in communion with God. And that is the rational basis for making moral and political judgments. So the rational basis of moral and political judgments is that human existence is teleological. Now, that's really fundamental. And when I say rational basis, I mean that you can give reasons that other people can understand for your moral and political convictions. They're not just feelings. It's not emotivism. It's not just, oh, well, this is just how I feel about this or that or the other thing. There's a rational basis. You may not accept the rationale, but you'll be able to see it as rational, given my assumptions that human existence is teleological. Well, what the rise of modernity, the entering into the modern period with the emerging scientific ways of knowing and fractured within Western Christendom itself, is that world picture, there arise really compelling reasons to call it into question. And so you get this breakdown of this consensus, and what modern moral and political philosophy becomes about, to a large degree, if Taylor's right, if McIntyre is right, is about trying to supply a new rational justification for our moral and political commitments. And so this is the Enlightenment Project, but you're trying to find a rational justification for moral and political judgments that were at home in Christianity, that were funded by Christianity. Values like equality, generosity, compassion, honesty, civic mindedness. These things that come from that natively arose out of an Abrahamic picture of reality. You now need a new rational justification for them. And so much of modern moral philosophy, much of the Enlightenment Project, is trying to find an objectively rational basis for those moral commitments that don't rely on explicit faith in the God of Christianity. Maybe you still feature the God of deism, but there needs to be an objectively rational basis for these moral commitments. Go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, because I think a listener might be confused, like, well, wouldn't a teleological rooting of this stuff in God, isn't that objective because it's not subjective? It's not just my feelings and vibes. And so I just wanted to make a clarifying observation, or maybe it's a question about, like, I think what you're saying in making it objective means it's not rooted to one theological tradition. And there's a kind of narration of, like, why the Enlightenment Project got started that I've heard, that, given the kind of, as Christianity was fracturing in Europe, and you have all sorts of wars between Catholics and Protestants and more radical Protestants, that a kind of more positive reading of the Enlightenment Project is like, well, let's try to find a way to be on the same page about some stuff that isn't rooted in Catholic tradition, Calvinism, Lutheranism, Anglicanism. And so the objective part means something that isn't tradition. Is that? right?
Yes, it means something that isn't tradition, and it certainly means that we fulfill the goal of human existence in communion with God, is a claim that for any Christian um, is going to function as objective. But
Right.
what the Enlightenment Project wants is to try to provide a foundation that any individual qua individual that's thinking clearly and is rational or operates out of common sense will accept.
Right.
Um, uh, and because the fear was that when you lose this teleological understanding, when you lose this medieval consensus, that nothing will replace it. That you will have no philosophical or theological apparatus at all to share values in common, and this will mean a coming apart of civilization. Um, and emergent state power especially needs there to be rational justifications that any human being qua human being would accept for moral and political commitments, and that project is one of the three that's still very much with us. So there's traditional forms of theism of the kind that I'm committed to. There's this Enlightenment Project, and then there's also Nietzschean anti-humanism. And and the useful thing that Nietzsche does is well, first of all, Nietzsche says, look, the God that made sense of that world picture from the Middle Ages is dead. And this was meant to be liberating news. But
Right.
his critique of the Enlightenment Project is something like the following, to the extent that I understand it in a deep way. His critique of the Enlightenment Project is to say, look, this project has not grappled honestly with the death of God.
Yeah.
Because the value set, the Christian value set that the Enlightenment wants to preserve, loses all its rational coherence, loses its rational justification with the death of God. And people like Kant and Locke, to take two Enlightenment examples, from Nietzsche's perspective, just haven't confronted, haven't grappled honestly with the fact that the death of God means the destruction of these values as somehow the content of morality, right? Nietzsche will say, there are many moralities. There can be many moral schemes. This one that emerges out of the Enlightenment was sustained by Christianity, which is now dead. You guys just aren't awake to it yet.
Yeah.
And so those are kind of the three projects. And for Nietzsche, this means once you realize this, you're liberated from that value array, and you're liberated to construct the transvaluation of values is the phrase. You're liberated to construct your own value set that's authentically expressive of your own sense of what is beautiful. It's largely an aesthetic judgment of what is meaningful, of
Mm-hmm.
what does it for you.
Right.
And all three of these influences are at work to one degree or another in the way that people in our society, whether they're philosophers or not, this isn't about just people who study these questions in a deep way. These are influences that are at work. In fact, I ask my students to map themselves on a triangle. Where are you on this traditional theism, Enlightenment humanism, Nietzschean anti-humanism? Where do you think you are here? Because these are the deep presumptive levels at which our judgments about things like liberalism or conservatism end up getting performed.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, you can find that people, even if they think of themselves as committed to traditional theism, would still probably there would be some of them who still agree that an individual person should be free to construct their own kind of worldview and what their values are and kind of how they go about their life, right? That these are over. Like, I guess what I'm getting at is these can be overlapping projects that one
Of
finds
course.
oneself in the middle of.
Of course. And one of the illusions I think that a person needs to get over. So I described myself earlier as somebody who's committed to traditional forms of theism. One of the things I have to get over is the idea that there's some pure version of that, that I'm standing there, and somehow neither Nietzsche nor the Enlightenment have any relevance in terms of valencing and informing my view of things. I mean, that would be silly. And a lot of times, this is one of the obstacles to mutual understanding is this lust for purity.
Yeah.
If you discover the pure version of, especially with Christianity in our society, this is often really destructive. If I discover the pure version, that's the goal. and part and parcel of that goal is naming the impurities. And of course, this isn't redemptive. It doesn't make for a redemptive conflict or redemptive conversation, obviously.
I do think you see a lot of that going on right now, particularly with some of the other YouTube content that's out there is trying to purge what is seen as the impurities. To me, it's interesting that that kind of the phrase that I think gets taken up, or one way of parsing that is like culture, right? That we're resisting culture.
Yeah,
And what it means to resist culture usually gets kind of pinned onto just like kind of very specific on the ground things like being inclusive of LGBTQ people, right? Or racism and anti-racism, right? Like that's like you just accept or reject these. But if you reject those, or feminism, right? That these kind of become litmus tests for the purity, and that somehow culture becomes this externalized thing that one either accepts or rejects. Whereas I think in the picture you're painting for us, like these three things are the waters we're all swimming in, right? It's all
absolutely,
there. It's all there.
absolutely.
And we're all probably participating in these projects to greater or lesser degrees unaware.
Well, the notion that there's something monolithic called culture that
Yeah.
you could position yourself as resistant to is also really strange. Our society is if any, it's far more complex in terms of the varieties of outlooks that are available to us, that are available to my kids, who are in their early 20s, in a way that they weren't even for me in the 90s, and certainly not for my parents in the 60s. I mean, what we have is an explosion of options for meaning. So the notion that there is, or that there even could be, one option that needs to be rejected above others is strange to me. It doesn't seem like a realistic response to how things actually are.
Right. I agree. I agree. With these with what you've been talking to us about around kind of traditional theism, the Enlightenment Project, and then kind of the Nietzschean death of God, how did these things, or maybe it's not all three of them, how did these things relate to liberalism?
Well, in the story that I just kind of told there in thumbnail form, for people like McIntyre and Taylor, and also for Nietzsche, um, liberalism, and if if that by if by that we mean a moral and political philosophy that tries to offer a set of values that we often call liberal values. They're very, very similar to the moral and political inheritance of Christianity. So the fundamental one is equality, that every
Yeah.
human being is of equal value. Now, Christians and Jews and Muslims have an easy answer to this question. Why should I take that seriously? Why should I think that Patrick Mahomes and the
Okay.
custodial staff at Arrowhead Stadium are all equally valuable, have the same moral status, when they clearly don't have the same value to the Kansas City Chiefs, right? I mean,
Right.
Aristotle will say they don't have the same value. What are you, crazy? I mean, how could you possibly think that they have the same value? They don't.
Yeah.
Um, the Christian difference, or an important influence of Abrahamic pictures of the world, is that they insist that because human beings are made in the image of God, every human being has the same intrinsic value. Now, liberalism, as a philosophical and political project, wants to keep that. Only instead of saying it's something that we learn because it's revealed by God, it's something that we know as a matter of common sense, or it's something that is objectively rational. If you're rational, you will know this. And then, having learned that sort of common sense, what we need is to erect political structures, mainly state structures, that incent individuals to use their autonomy in ways that are consistent with that value set. We might call it enlightened self-interest, right? So I contribute to the common good because I ultimately know it helps me. And so you have a commitment to the common good on the basis of those values that sustain society according to a commonly shared set of values, and we share them not because God has revealed them to us in the Torah or in the Quran or in Christ. We share them because they're rational, because they are commonsensical. While that view, clearly in the story I'm telling and that I've learned from others, while that value array is the offspring of Christianity, it's transformed by the removal of a God that reveals God's self in history. And Nietzsche will argue that renders it incoherent. And I think I agree with Nietzsche that it does. As much as I'm glad that value array continues to be sustained by something like liberalism, the something is at the end of the day not coherent.
Yeah. I'm going to summarize what you're saying just for those listening, make sure they're tracking. So that liberalism is a political and moral philosophy that in a lot of ways is kind of the grandchild of Christianity, because it holds to certain Christian values such as the equality of people, right? And that we should be civic and generosity and share life together. But what makes it different from Christianity is it no longer has that teleological end where it's rooted in our life being oriented to the God who made us, but rather we should treat everybody fairly and equally because isn't that obvious? Or it's can be rationally sustained. But what Nietzsche, and I agree with you, I think Nietzsche gets this right. If there is no God to sustain that, it doesn't become coherent at the end of the day. Like there's no reason to think that, as you said, like Patrick Mahomes and the custodial staff are worth the same. Or even, in other trickier situations, like, that, somebody who's 100 years old and nearing the end of their life and in the hospital, that their life has value the same as a newborn baby or the CEO of a company or your favorite YouTuber, right? That all these people have equal worth before God is a hard claim to sustain if there is no God.
Absolutely. And we could point to an array of historical examples. One of the things I emphasize to my students is how unusual it is, how rare it has been in the scope of human history for any society to be committed to the basic equality of every individual. That's exceptional. What's more usual are systems of hierarchy, of really entrenched hierarchy, and we're seeing a revival of it. I mean, as the influence of Christianity over our society, and I'm not again nostalgic for Christendom. That is not my point.
Right.
But the fact is that our society historically has been deeply influenced by Christian commitments, even if it's informally. As that recedes, what we're seeing at the same time is a recession of commitment to liberal values. That's not a coincidence. And so you have, plutocratic people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and these fellows who really there really does seem to be an ideological and aristocratic ideology that is representing itself, where people like them are at the top of the pyramid because of merit.
Right.
And even some people who are not committed to an aristocratic picture of society speak in terms of meritocracy without, I think, thinking very carefully about what meritocracy would actually mean. If we're achievable, like, so untalented people just starve. That reemergence of an aristocratic picture of society is very powerful right now, and I don't think it's a coincidence that it is coming together with a recession of Christian influence over our society.
When we were chatting before we hit the record button, one of the things you mentioned was how certain forms of traditional theism, as you're calling it, have a hard time grappling with liberalism. And I'm just wondering if you could speak more to that. Why is it you think certain forms of traditional theism have a hard time grappling with liberalism that we've inherited today?
I'm tempted to give a really pithy answer.
Do it.
That could have the potential to be misleading. The reason it has so much trouble grappling with it is because they're so similar. I think it's really true that what we talk about as liberal values are the product of Abrahamic commitments, Abrahamic moral commitments. And so when we're looking at liberalism, we're looking at a lot of things, a lot of commitments that we ought to have in common, but with the loss of the God that made it rationally justifiable. So what liberalism tends to devolve into, because of its resourcelessness on exactly this front, is that the only value it knows how to really cherish and treat as intrinsic is autonomy, individual autonomy. And it doesn't matter if you're dealing with so-called conservatives who want to make sure you don't take their guns, or so-called liberals, talking about issues like reproductive health. And those are complicated matters. But what I'm pointing to is what they have in common, which is a bedrock commitment to autonomy as an intrinsic value, not as an instrumental value, but an intrinsic value. And this is especially bad with libertarianism, which absolutely treats autonomy as an intrinsic good. And this is, so whereas for traditional Christianity, the human good and freedom is found in ordering yourself towards the rational goal of your existence, which is communion with God.
Yeah.
And autonomy is an instrumental good. If what we mean by autonomy is my freedom to do what I want with myself, it's only good when it is ordered in that direction. The liberal transformation of this is that autonomy becomes freestanding. And that is the root of a lot of the tension between traditional forms of Christianity and the liberalism. And it often, that becomes visible in a lot of ways. And so the instinct for a certain kind of quote unquote conservative or traditional Christian is to, on that basis, reject the whole liberal project. But that overlooks how much the liberal project has in common with traditional Christianity. And that makes it fraught and complicated for Christians to deal with so-called liberalism. When autonomy is the only moral resource we have to draw on, it's not at all clear that that's going to lead to values like equality, compassion, empathy, generosity, honesty, all of those things, because it's untethered from goals. It's untethered from a telos. And that's a big lacuna. It's a big empty spot within liberalism.
What you see in a lot of these YouTube channels that are putting forth kind of resources for what they think of as a more conservative form of Christianity is that to reject liberalism means to reject women's ordination and same-sex marriage. And I think to acknowledge charitably how one might parse that is that certain denominations have embraced women's ordination and same-sex marriage. It's part of that liberal project, right? That we can't say ordination is only for men because that restricts the autonomy of women to have equal access to a profession or a vocation, which is wrong. Just like it would be wrong to say women can't be CEOs or chefs or horse jockeys or whatever else you want to put there. And then same too for same-sex marriage, that is constraining the autonomy of an individual to marry whoever that person wants to marry. And so by rejecting those two things, it's kind of like the rejecting liberalism. And I'm wondering if there's a way, do you think that's sufficient though? Is like, are those two things enough to say one is really free of the liberal project? Or is that even like a fair way of trying to address liberalism?
So when it comes to something like same-sex marriage, and right now maybe we're on the precipice of beginning to talk about polyamory, in our faith tradition, in our faith community, and the one thing that that I would urge is that we not make autonomy and liberal inclusion the content of our reflection on those matters. So I completely affirm full LGBTQ plus inclusion in the life of the church, and including marriage and ordination and all of that, but not on liberal grounds. And the difference is the better beginning place when we're talking, for instance, about marriage is to ask this question: what is marriage for?
Yeah.
What ends is marriage meant to pursue? What do Christians, how does marriage serve the church? Not just the autonomy of individuals. How does marriage serve the church? How does marriage serve the two people who are involved in it? How does marriage welcome children who can be trained in discipleship in the life of the church? Mm-hmm. These are the questions about what marriage is, not merely a question about an individual person's autonomy and their sense of their own self-fulfillment. Obviously, that includes that. I mean, that's not that that's unimportant. It just can't be the end-all and be-all question. And so the liberal argument for same-sex marriage, which I affirm, I mean, same-sex marriage I affirm, but the liberal argument in favor of it, I find completely unconvincing.
Yeah.
And the same goes for women's ordination. From my perspective, LGBTQ plus inclusion and women's ordination are both cases where the tradition, being responsive to our tradition and asking teleological questions about church leadership and about marriage, gets this work done in a really honest way without needing to rely upon vague liberal inclusion or vague notions of tolerance, where the only vice is intolerance. That's just too thin an account of our life together as Christians to be sustainable. And of course, this is precisely what conservatives, so-called, rightly reject about liberalism. But the problem is that liberalism also has a great deal in common with Christianity, as that example illustrates, but it's deep critique of capitalism. I mean, if somebody is committed to the way of Jesus and committed to the teachings of the church over the centuries and doesn't see that they should be critics of capitalism, it's really hard for me to believe that they're engaged in good faith dialogue with tradition. And that's another thing we have in common with liberalism. It's another thing we have in common with Marxists, and it's not surprising.
Yeah. So I hope what somebody listening is hearing this is what we're talking about in this is not necessarily to present a case for LGBTQ inclusion or women's ordination, but that there are accounts of why people land in those positions that Scott and I both agree with. We both believe God calls women to be ordained. We both believe there is a place in the church for LGBTQ people, including marriage and ordination in leadership. But to root those in liberal arguments of autonomy are thin and not enough. But there are robust theological accounts that do draw on tradition in deep ways to get there. And that's perhaps worth exploring in another episode. I do think your point about capitalism is interesting, especially we have a new pope who has chosen the name Leo the 14th. And, if you go back to Leo the 13th, I mean, yeah, he was the one who said our Anglican orders are void and null. But more interestingly than that is he did release a papal encyclical that offered a deep critique of both capitalism and socialism in his day. And so I'm wondering, before we hit record, we were talking a bit about, in this rush to label stuff liberal, conservative, that's too constraining to actually hear people. It kind of prevents that generosity you were talking about and how we listen to other people. So I wonder, can you speak more to this? Like, what's the problem with wanting to try to label Leo the 14th conservative or liberal?
My short initial answer is that the desire to do that is rooted in a desire to put Catholic moral and political teaching on the liberal map, either towards its conservative end or towards its liberal left-leaning end. And this just isn't our worldview. This shouldn't be the set of presumptions out of which we work. Traditional Christian moral and political teaching, to which Leo the 14th, just like all of his predecessors, is beholden and is a custodian of, is going to be ouchy for both conservatives and liberals. Now, at various times. Now, it's going to be ouchy for MAGA folks way, way, way more often than it's going to be ouchy for Bernie Sanders. But it is going to be ouchy for Bernie Sanders because it's going to be ouchy for anybody whose bedrock moral commitment is autonomy. And so the attempt to say that, where do we fit him in? To say, well, Francis was a liberal, Benedict was a conservative, John Paul II was a conservative. Are we going to have, what's going to be next? Is it going to be a liberal or a conservative? It completely misreads the breadth and the depth of Catholic assumptions about God and about the world, which are not rooted in autonomy. The world is not godless. People are of intrinsic value because that value comes from the God that made them. That set of presumptions is going to temper the value of autonomy in a way that is going to, where autonomy means I do what I want with myself, and any interference with that is wrong. Um, you're you're gonna there's going to be a confrontation there. It to understand Leo specifically, or Catholic moral and political teaching historically, you really have to lose those eyeglasses. You really have to lose the conservative liberal binary. It just doesn't help. And by the way, it occurs to me, even in my own ears, I want to make sure I make something clear that, a lot of times when liberation theology, for example, says of oppressed or marginalized groups that what they want for them is greater autonomy, of course, that is good and wholesome, and of course, more freedom, more self-determination, of course. What I'm talking about is whether autonomy is the intrinsic good that human existence pursues in and of itself. And the answer to that question, it seems to me, has to be no.
Right, because even in liberation theology, where it's looking for autonomy, I mean, you talked about intrinsic autonomy, and then what was the other way of thinking of autonomy where it serves an end?
It's an instrumental good rather than an
Yeah,
intrinsic one.
yeah, I would think in liberation theology, they're looking for autonomy as an instrumental good, right? Oppressed people should be freed to pursue their God given life in a way that honors God. I mean,
Yes.
I think about the situations in Central and South America where or in the Black Church here in the United States, where liberation theology came to be. I mean, it's not that they're just looking for greater autonomy so they can go to the mall and
Right.
or shop on Amazon or wherever and buy the stuff they want to do, pursue their favorite fandoms, right? It's like
Right.
we would like to not be have our to be paid pennies for our labor so that people in other countries can eat cheap bananas. We would be able
Sure.
to like to live a life free of the fear of being disappeared by a brutal government. I mean, little
Absolutely.
things like that. Um,
Yeah. And we want to be liberated from the logics of colonial capitalism, which, and
yeah.
that's, yeah.
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 And that's I mean, I've come across, not, I haven't really watched any videos of anybody here on YouTube that are like deep dives into critiquing liberation theology, but the few times I've heard it mentioned does seem to just very easily parse it onto yet another form of liberal Christianity, which I think is like super unfair to liberation theology. There's something very different than, a Christian who is so committed to individual autonomy that there should be no boundaries to how a Christian lives their lives. That's like really different than oppressed peasants wanting to not have to live with death squads killing them.
Right. 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 And, liberation theology isn't monolithic.
Yeah.
And that is really unfair when the voices of liberation theology are reduced to simply being liberalism that uses church words. That's really unfair. Although it sometimes, in my experience, is fair of some people who are not liberation theologians themselves, but are attracted to liberation theology. Sometimes liberation theology does provide people with a language that they can deploy to make the gospel liberalism or progressivism plus church words. And of course that does name to me a kind of impoverished vision of the gospel. But to hang that on liberation theologians themselves seems manifestly unjust
Yeah.
to me.
It's reminding me like, so with this, I think what I hope somebody's getting from this conversation we're having is to perhaps approach different things with more charity than simply labeling them conservative or liberal really affords us.
Mm-hmm.
Because you mentioned a phrase from like maybe a professor of yours. I mean, when I was at Duke, they talked about having a hermeneutic of charity, right? Like trying to understand an argument in its best light to then critique it rather than a hermeneutic of suspicion and just looking for the weakest point or assuming bad
Sure.
motives. There was a different phrase you used though. That
So it's a phrase that I stole from a guy named Ram Kohl's, who's a philosopher and taught me a lot about Nietzsche and Derrida and any number of other um, postmodern, mainly philosophers. And his phrase was receptive generosity.
okay.
Um, and to the extent that I understood what he meant by it, or do understand what he meant by it, I mean, it's a little bit self-explanatory. It's a willingness to hear from people who do not share your view or part of communities and sets of practices that are not yours. A willingness to be generous to them and to hear from them in a way that can point to redemptive possibilities of mutual understanding. And, you know, he was not a Christian, or is not a Christian, but to me, something like this virtue of receptive generosity is simply demanded by the gospel. I mean, even if we are willing to talk about having enemies, which we often probably will need to, enemy love is at the heart of it. And it seems to me that receptive generosity, even when we're dealing with somebody who we're tempted to think of as an enemy, is absolutely critical to conducting things in the way of Jesus. One of the signs to me that allegedly Christian analysis of political or moral or social issues has simply collapsed into vague forms of liberalism. In addition to if autonomy is the only moral value you're able or willing to defend coherently. I know that things have probably gone off the rails a bit. But the other thing is willingness to treat the state as the only relevant political actor. And beyond that, the willingness to use coercion. Once you want to defend the liberal value set or enforce the liberal value set, using coercion, using force, using manipulation, I know we're off the map of the way of Jesus in terms of how we deal with our others. And so that's another important, and it's that's me looking in the mirror, really. I mean, that's something we have to internalize, that the way of Jesus means that we can't engage coercively with our others.
And that leads me to another question I want to ask. We've tried to kind of like map some of these various philosophical influences that we inherit today that shape us all. And you talked about being committed to kind of traditioned theism. So what advice do you have for people? Like how do we root ourselves deeper into traditioned theism or the gospel in the midst of the world we find ourselves in?
Well, the first most important thing that I would say is that, so we're talking at a really philosophical level here about ideas.
Yeah.
But you know, the gospel isn't an idea. It is a lived reality, and the primary place where that lived reality takes place is the life of the church.
Yep.
The mystical body that Christ has called into existence. To me, there simply is no way of being a Christian, whether you call it traditional theism, however you configure it. There's no way of sustaining it or inhabiting it that does not involve at its heart the church. And so that's the first thing. You have to stay involved and be involved in the life of Christian community. That's completely indispensable. Everything, you know, that I, as a philosopher or theologian, you know, talk about when I'm, you know, running at the mouth about things like this is submitted to the life of the church. If it doesn't work for the life of the church, then it's not helpful. It's not useful. It needs to be reexamined or critiqued or even jettisoned. So that's the first most important thing. The other thing is to what you find in the church are exemplars, and we have to be submitting ourselves to exemplars. Notice how counter-individualistic and that is, and also undermining of our sense of ourselves as autonomous individuals. The point of Scott Williams is Scott Williams, and I decide what's good for me.
Yeah,
you that won't sustain you in the way that submission to examples of Christian virtue will. And I don't know everything about everybody's church. But I have, as the husband of a United Methodist pastors itinerate, my experience of church life is pretty wide. And I have always been able to find exemplars. I
Yeah.
have always been able to find within the life of the church people who are further down the path of holiness than I am. And I, that's hugely important. And you will find plenty of opportunities in the life of the church also to practice receptive generosity within the church. You know, the church will provide you with people. God will give you people through the church that you would not have chosen to hang out with otherwise. And you will need to become the kind of person who is able to be receptive and generous with those people. Just like in worshiping in through the liturgy, we learn to become the kind of people for whom that liturgy is beautiful. That's the goal. You know, not does this do it for me? It's can I become the kind of person for whom this does it?
Right. And so you're talking about the life of virtue.
Yes.
What this is talking about. That the
Yes.
practices we put into place become habits and then grow into virtue, that we become
Yeah.
particular types of people, which I think, yeah, I think that's it.
And
The,
over the last 5 minutes of church history, that has been associated largely in our world with Stanley Hauerwas.
yeah,
But it's Maximus the Confessor, it's the
right.
Cappadocians, it's St. Thomas Aquinas.
It's not just the new kind of
Yeah.
sexy theological thing.
No, and it isn't even new anymore. I mean, I'm 55 years old. I mean, so I know that this is not the cutting edge stuff anymore. As soon as you see human existence as teleological and ordered towards communion with God, you're going to find that language of virtues and vices and immediately useful and helpful. Whether they exhaust everything that it means to be a Christian or to live in the way of Jesus or to live into our destiny of friendship with God is is another question, but it's tremendously useful in describing that journey, and has been for a long, long, long time that predates modernity. And I
Yeah.
think that's important to recognize.
So I would hope somebody watching this, especially if you're somebody who is maybe your journey into Christianity has largely been perhaps inside your head through watching videos like this, is that I don't think the way to go deeper down this path with Jesus is to only watch more videos to try to rationally grasp which denomination is the pure one, or the one that is the one true inheritor of the deposit of the faith, because you can't follow Jesus by yourself or just by watching YouTube videos. You gotta, like, you have to actually go to a church. When Scott is talking about, number one, it involves the church, he doesn't mean a theoretical, abstract, capital C church. He means like you on Sunday, you need to be somewhere, right?
Yes, yes, yes. As a beginning place on Sunday. I mean, that's the indispensable beginning place is that you would worship in a church on Sunday. I obviously don't have any argument with somebody because I'm one of these people who is looking around at churches, what we call denominations, and asking, where do I see continuity with the deposit of the faith? I don't think that's a wrong question.
Right.
What is a wrong question is, where is it pure? Where is it unalloyed? What's the one right one? That's not a thing. Um,
Yeah.
uh,
And
so you know, yeah.
yeah, so to find that church, but that, like, I think it also just involves some trust. I mean, like, if your life is oriented towards God, you, you have to trust that that God is there and will lead you, and that, you to venture forth in faith to actually go to a church. Yeah, maybe you hear something from the pulpit you don't agree with, but I think the first step in that is that generosity, is that hermeneutic of charity or receptive generosity, is to try to understand, like, why, like, because we can experience that as an assault on our autonomy. Like, I don't want to hear that, right? Like, this is
Mhm.
somehow checking something in me. It could be that it's something that is out of line with Christian teaching. Don't mishear me. My experience with people who get upset with something I've said it's very rare that they think I'm just getting Christianity wrong. It's usually you said something I didn't want to hear.
Yeah.
And when I try to gently invite them to examine, well, why is that? Like, why don't you want to hear that? It like that's when the wheels fall off. And so like if you're gonna venture forth to a church, you got to trust that God is gonna meet you there. Like that the Holy Spirit is at work in your life, and that as Scott was talking about, that there will be people there that God will use to teach you this faith.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. But that's the step. I mean, you have to be willing to submit yourself to the life of a community, and not merely out of enlightened self-interest. I had a student ask me, he kind of wanted to combine, the sort of Nietzschean, I construct for me a spirituality, a sense of life being meaningful that suits me. It was very kind of therapeutic in the negative sense, very kind of therapeutic. I construct me using whatever images I like, and I want Catholicism to be part of that. And he said to me, "Now, if you were my priest, what would you say?" I would say, "Wonderful. We love that you're participating in the life of the church. Anything that gets you to start to want to follow Jesus, I'm down with. But there is need for growth here, because it isn't about you constructing for yourself your own spirituality. It's about learning to grow ever and ever more into your identity as God's creature, and learning more and more about what it means to grow into that identity, which is not purely your construction." And so that's an important difference. If I were sort of looking for a church, and I arrived there, and it was clearly all designed to cater to me and for me to construct an identity and a meaning and a morality for me on my own, and it was catered to all of those desires, that would constitute a reason for me to split. Um, Not necessarily that the preacher said something I disagreed with, but that I can see that this isn't asking me in any way to submit to anything, and that's the name of a problem.
I liken, because with this, I usually use this for spiritual disciplines, but I think it's true of what you're saying too, is that it's a lot like maybe starting anything that takes time to be good at, like physical exercise. If you decide you want to get into running and you just try to just go run 3 miles, having been sedentary, like it's going to feel awful.
Yeah.
And and like, there's no sense you're going to get in that first 3 mile slog that this is benefiting you.
Right.
And that's where you have to understand that, like, right, the end, like this serves an end of being able to increase endurance or get your heart rate up, improve your health, improve your mood, whatever these things are. You have to be able to see that long-term end for the discomfort and suffering in that first run, in the first few.
And it's important to say, especially right here when we're in this lane, it's important to say that among the goals of that journey is for you to feel better and feel fulfilled.
Yeah.
So it's not like you feeling fulfilled and happy and content, and fully realized is oh well, that's navel gazing, and you have to stop thinking about that and buckle down. No, the Christian life is supposed to, it does, the way of Jesus does lead to this liberation, to this sense of contentment, this sense of fulfillment. And maybe along the way, you will find seeing a therapist useful, as I have.
Yep.
Maybe along the way, you will find the meditative practices that go by the name of yoga in our social order, tremendously helpful. I mean, so it's not an either or, but the first step is not necessarily the question, how do I meet my currently felt needs? The first step is, how do I direct myself towards the goal of communion with God, which at this moment, because I'm at the first step on that journey, I don't even really understand right now everything that journey will mean or will require. So there's no way to plan at the beginning what the tools will be along the way.
Yeah. or to tie it into scripture, the disciples don't figure out who Jesus is by just like sitting back and like trying to imagine what following him would be like, or try to figure him out at the beginning, right? You only come to know who Jesus is by actually following him.
Yes. And also, and it matters how we follow him. So you point to the example of the disciples. I would argue that in the New Testament, in the Gospels, the disciples never really understand Jesus very well,
Right.
right up through the end. And you know who does understand him pretty well are the women who were dedicated to diaconia, who were dedicated to service.
Yeah.
Like, the disciples concentrated on questions of greatness and domination, and who would lead. The women along the way concentrated on diaconia, on service of others. Obviously, the patriarchy of that time, made it that way, but it positioned them to understand Jesus better and to
Yep.
believe the good news of the resurrection at the end when Peter didn't. So it's not only about following Jesus, but following Jesus in a manner of service that teaches
Yeah.
us what it means to follow Jesus and to understand Jesus well.
Yeah. And it's their service too that we're in a year of the lectionary where we're going through Luke, and what really struck me as we were going through Holy Week not too long ago, was that the women are there at the cross, right? They're there at the end. They watch to the end. They go home for the Sabbath. They go home and they prepare the burial spices, right? And like they are there and hear the angel's announcement of the resurrection because they were willing to do that service. And, and
Yes.
and I think too, it also points to the centrality of the cross and understanding who Jesus is. Um,
Yes. And when the women deliver the news to the disciples in Luke, it says explicitly that they were not believed.
right,
They didn't believe. They just didn't believe him. And then there's a verse that says Peter at least went to check to see if the story was plausible. But there's a little footnote next to that verse that says some ancient authorities omit this verse. So I'm not saying what happened, but it is
right,
possible that later on, somebody rehabilitated Peter a little bit. But still, yeah, the disciples seemed unprepared to understand the reality of the cross. The women were prepared for it, were able to, or if they weren't prepared for it, maybe that's the wrong thing to say. They were accepting of it, and they were also receptive to the good news because of the different ways they had concentrated their following of Jesus. And so putting yourself to the service of others can already feel like a terrible disruption of our autonomy.
mm-hmm.
Uh, but it's what has to happen from the get-go.
The last question I want to ask, because as we're encouraging people, both in this kind of bigger philosophical thing to kind of help see a bigger picture of like the philosophical, theological state of the world we're in, but also for those trying to find a church in the midst of this, that you can't, be Christian on your own. You need a church. So we've talked some about examples and stuff like that. But in that desire to find continuity with the deposit of the faith and with the teaching of the apostles, what kinds of things would you be looking for in the teaching or preaching of a church if you were going off to find a new one? Or maybe the better way to ask it is, what would you advise, say, one of your undergrad students who's like, how do I know what to listen for in the preaching and teaching of a church to know it is continuous?
So I myself would begin the things that you've said, preaching and teaching, they're really, really important. But I myself would begin with liturgy.
Okay.
What do we pray? What do we say? What do we sing when we are together? And is this, first of all, is it recognizable as continuous with what Christians have often said in the past, have usually for centuries said and sung and prayed that we believe? Not that it has to be slavishly obedient or, word for word exactly the same as, there's no such thing as that. There's no pure liturgy that comes down to it. But is this recognizable as continuous with that, and with that deposit? And obviously, I'm hopelessly biased. That to me, that's a tremendous virtue of the kind of Anglicanism that I represent and am most attracted to and think is most continuous with that deposit of faith. Because the liturgy will save you, even if the preacher's bad, even if my homily is bad. A person who's there will still have been nourished by that liturgy. And in terms of preaching and teaching, the things I look for is an acquaintance of mine finds it useful to ask people the question, what would you like to hear me preach on? And the answer is supposed to be a topic. Like, what topic should I preach on? Mm-hmm. This is a misguided question. The topic of every sermon, from my point of view, is a piece of assigned scripture or assigned scriptures. Is the preacher submitting him or herself to the assignment that they've been given on that day? Are they responding in a good faith way to the scriptural deposit? Again, the last thing this means is biblical literalism. The last thing this means is biblical inerrancy or any of those unusual doctrines. But what it does mean is that my job is to respond to the deposit of faith as that is manifest in scripture on Sunday morning. And so when I hear a preacher who is just apparently that week decided they want to preach on patience, and then they went and found a bunch of scriptures that help them make whatever case they want to make, that's backwards. And this goes back to liturgy. I want to hear scripture read on Sunday morning. If I walk into a worship service and there's only one assigned scripture, that's alarming. I know that we're not being responsive in a traditional way to the deposit of the scriptures, and so that's another thing. And we're a manifestation of creedal Christianity, and I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing. Are the things that I'm hearing being preached and being taught, are they consistent with the deposit of faith as it is manifest in the creeds? Yep. And in the sort of official teachings of our church, do I think that there's integrity there? At the very least, in being a good faith response to those teachings that takes them seriously.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for your time, and do hope to have you on again, because we went to the same seminary and we're fortunate to have all the correct opinions. And
yes,
we need to get them.
It's liberating to just be right.
I know, but also a burden because,
oh no,
we still have to go to parties and try to not be too insufferable.
I don't know how good I am at
that. All right. Well, take care and God bless. And
you too. Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed it.